What up, folks? Once again, it's your boy Tim, the handsome liberal. Could America ever find itself involved in a second civil war? We know how brutal the first civil war was, took place between 1861 and 1865. We still use terms like Yankees and Confederates. Obviously, the Confederate flag is still flying in a number of places in the United States, so they clearly haven't got over the first civil war. But could this ever happen again? Well, if you follow politics and you pay attention to a lot of hot button topics that have come up in America, you've undoubtedly heard people talking about the possibility of this happening again. And I'm going to tell you why and how it could happen. And in my humble opinion, I think absolutely we could have a second civil war. But before we get into that, I'm asked that you do what I always ask you to do. Show your boys some love. Go ahead and click that subscription. Hit the bell so you know when I'm dropping these gems. At the end of the video, you like what I had to say, show your boy some love, give me a thumbs up. If not, feel free to hit the thumbs down, but drop me a comment. Let me know what the hell you found wrong with what I had to say. Second Civil War, could we have that take place in America? Well, we have to first figure out what is the definition of a civil war. A war between political factions or regions within the same country. So political factions, when we say politics, we're talking, say, for instance, left and right, liberal and conservative, but that's not the only political factions that exist in the country. We'll get into that. And of course, different regions could be exactly what took place, a war between the North and the South or the East and the West. Kind of what you have in terms of gang violence in a lot of cities. The North Siders are fighting the South Siders and all of that. It sounds crazy as hell, but keep in mind, that is the basis for the teams deciding what team you were on in the Civil War. You were either on the North or you were on the South. So somebody say South Side Crips or East Side Bloods, and it sounds ridiculous to you. Keep in mind the Confederates were South Side Americans and the Yankees were North Side Americans. So very similar in that aspect. So what might cause a civil war to take place? Well, first, you need factions. You need to look and figure out who might be the groups that might cause a civil war or who might be on the teams. Well, in America, we have a variety of particular groups. And in most cases, you're going to get hostility or you're going to get an outcry based on a group that's believing that something isn't going right in their life. They're being mistreated or their freedoms are being denied or, something is being taken away from them unjustly so. And that's how you start developing groups. In America, I'm going to give you the groups that, for the most part, would have this type of a sentiment and could lead to something of this nature taking place. Those groups would be blacks, African Americans, the LGBT community, women, whites, and Hispanics or the Latino community. These are the particular groups that in America tend to often say that they believe that they're being mistreated. They believe that the system is against them. All of these groups currently, right now in 2021, commonly state that they believe that they're being mistreated. Once again, those groups are blacks or African Americans, the LGBT community, women, whites or the Caucasian community, and Hispanics or the Latino community. So what hot button issues could lead to this sparking some type of a outcry or some type of a battle, war, whatever you want to call it? Well, here's some of the things that we tend to see right now, even on the news in 2021. Well, with the black community, there's the belief that the police or systemic racism is a problem. With the LGBT community, the transgender portion of that community is literally always in the news right now. Women, whether it's the pay, whether they're complaining about the pay increase or the Me Too movement. There's several movements that have happened amongst the women's group recently in the last year or two. Obviously, with whites, there's going to be a host of issues from immigration to the LGBT community to critical race theory. They're angry about several issues. And of course, with Hispanics, it's going to be immigration. So when we look at these issues and when we look at the groups that I just named, two of these groups, two members of the groups that I mentioned, between blacks, LGBTs, whites, women, and Hispanics, only two of these groups have already taken upon themselves to commit acts of violence to upset what they believed is the imbalance in the way they were treated. And those two groups would be blacks and whites. There hasn't been a lot of outcry in terms of violence from the LGBT community, women, or Hispanics. But blacks and whites have actually committed acts of violence in very, very recently. What I mean would be blacks or African Americans believe that systemic racism is a real thing. And as you know, in the summer of 2020, there were riots and looting and fires and things like that set all over several major cities in America. You know, starting with, say, Ferguson, Minneapolis had issues, Baltimore had issues, over Freddie Gray. So when you name these different names, say his name or say her name, most of those towns had some serious violence going on. So blacks absolutely have already, I won't say necessarily taken up arms, but to some degree, yeah, they've already taken up arms or actually launched violent outcries. And of course, the same thing would apply to whites. I mean, we could start with something simple as the insurrection on January 6th, but there's a host of other issues that are hot button issues that have triggered whites in recent years as well. That would be immigration. That would be abortion. There's been clinics that have been bombed. Racism. I mean, we have to bring that up. There's been churches shot up. You know, there was a shooting at a Walmart in El Paso where the guy deliberately targeted Hispanics. There's been and the racism issue has been questionable in the black community as well as Asians have been targeted with COVID-19, which is another issue. It's a hot button issue that have triggered people. Muslims and terrorism. The belief that Muslims are committing terrorism has angered the white community to the point where they've taken upon themselves to commit acts of violence. And of course, the LGBT transgender community has also angered whites in the Caucasian community, where they have taken upon acts of violence. And when I say taken upon acts of violence, I mean there are recent news stories to show gunmen or aggressors committing acts based on those issues, based on immigration, based on abortion, racism, Muslims, and the LGBT community. In most of these cases, you're talking about killing people. So certainly if there was going to be an issue with a civil war, it would be probably launched by blacks or probably launched by whites, because those are the two angriest groups out of the ones that I mentioned. Now, the issue is, if there was a civil war, what else might start it? Well, and also when I say the different groups, there's a couple other groups which I think are actually even larger that I did not mention, and that is conservatives and liberals. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of these groups they kind of identify with conservatives or liberals. If I say, for instance, blacks believe that the police are mistreating them and systemic racism. Well, liberals believe that too. White liberals believe that. Hispanic liberals believe the same thing that African Americans might believe in regards to being mistreated by police. You're not going to find a whole lot of white liberals who don't believe that blacks are being mistreated by police. They believe it as well. So if something actually did break out, which when it did break out throughout these different cities that I just mentioned, whereas you had Black Lives Matter or some of these different black movements looting, right? Well, there were white liberals in those crowds. I mean, there was Chaz in Portland where they took over a 6 city blocks in that area. That was mostly white people, white liberals. So they also are on the side of blacks. So and this is the reason I'm bringing this up, is because our first Civil War was predominantly a North and South thing. It was white on white. And a lot of folks tend to believe that if we have a civil war, a second civil war, it's going to be racially based. I don't necessarily buy into that as much, because there are a lot of white liberals that would probably most likely side with African Americans. It's the conservative, the Caucasians on the conservative side that would probably not. And like, for instance, when you hear folks saying that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group, you don't hear liberals talking like that. You don't hear white liberals saying that. That is a white conservative belief. Just like when you hear folks talking about the election was stolen, you're not going to hear white liberals suggesting that the election is stolen. In fact, the way white conservatives are angry about the hot button issues I mentioned, immigration, abortion, Muslims and terrorism. Most of that is all white conservative things that are angering white conservatives. You're not going to hear a whole lot of white liberals speaking very hostile in regards to the immigration problem that America has, or the LGBT crowd supposedly taking over, or even critical race theory, any of these things. So these are things that anger the white conservative base. So what I'm saying, though, is any of this stuff could lead to some serious violence. I mean, there are people who are very angry about the thought of a transgender female, so to speak, entering the children's bathroom where there's other girls, or playing on a team, a female's team. There are people who are really angry about that to the point where they can potentially commit violence. Obviously, the terrorism aspect from the early 2000s, from the Middle Eastern community, there were just a host of acts of violence on that. So fortunately, that did not lead to anything worse for the Muslim community. Maybe the fact that we're out of the Middle East may help that simmer down some, but Muslims have paid a heavy price after what happened on 9/11 in this country. Whether they had anything or any knowledge of it or not, they paid a heavy price for that. Abortion is kind of a hot button topic, but not as much. I mean, there are a lot of Americans who are anti-abortion, but as far as going around bombing clinics and killing doctors, it has happened. Tiller, the baby killer in Kansas, if you follow right-wing politics, is a good example of that, but not as much. And then, of course, immigration is a huge hot-button topic. You've had 3%ers, you've had Oath Keepers, you've had all sorts of right-wing groups give their own services on the border. Armed men, armed militia showing up to the border, supposedly ready to protect America's sovereign border from illegal immigrants entering in the country, but they clearly were armed to the teeth and willing to shoot if they had to. So immigration could absolutely lead to that aspect. In fact, right now you have President Biden supposedly, because there's no confirmation of this that I know of, but supposedly offering to compensate illegals that were separated at the border during the Trump administration. That absolutely is a hot button topic for any Trump supporter or any conservative right winger. And if Biden was to do something like that, that could lead to violence. So these are the type of things that would lead to violence. So the groups that would most likely, if something like this kicked off, the government is going to be on one side of that. It's not going to be white people fighting blacks or white people fighting Hispanics or gays. I don't really believe that would be the case. It's going to be the government defending some of these policies or some of these groups that are going to be the ones that are being attacked by one of the other groups. For instance, if blacks believe that there's systemic racism and they start attacking the police, that's the government. So you have blacks versus the government. Now, obviously, you may have Kyle Rittenhouse or Rittenhouse type whites that step in and help the government out. But for the most part, the climate is blacks pissed off with the government. So that's how that would go down. And of course, if you're, setting stores on fire and things like that, or setting private businesses on fire, once again, you're going to create an issue where you're going to start having those business owners or those homeowners getting pissed off that they're paying a price with their property for something they had nothing to do, and then they may in turn start attacking blacks. You may have a group of white homeowners deciding we're going to go hunt down Black Lives Matter members and shoot them. And that's how it kind of kicks off. Now, on the side of whites, it would be the same thing. It would originally start out with whites against the government. January 6th is a prime example of that. The the siege of the governor's house in Michigan, under Governor Whitmer, when they first were doing the mask mandates before the vaccine was even invented, and in that state, that she wanted to close down businesses and have people wear masks, and they seized the what is it, the government Capitol building in Michigan. That was a good example where you had an overwhelming force of armed Caucasians or armed white men come and seize the governor's building to the point where they couldn't fight back. They were outgunned. So it would start out that way, and then just like with blacks rioting and looting, you start harming innocent people because you're so pissed off, and then those innocent people join the side of the government, and then you have two enemies. Just like blacks are rioting and looting, first they're pissed off with cops, but because they're destroying innocent businesses, now those people are pissed off and they join the cops to go after blacks. Well, that would happen in this case. You're going to start out pissed off with the government that too many illegals are coming here, for instance. And in turn, you're going to probably injure, if not kill, innocent Hispanics. And that has happened, by the way, whereas you got Hispanics that were born and raised in America, and they're being stopped and frisked, or they get pulled over, and it's a demand that they show their paperwork and things like that, or in some cases they just be met with outright violence on the grounds that you shouldn't be in our country, and then you find out, well, this is a third generation Hispanic that you killed, So that ends up happening, and before you know it, the Hispanics are on the side of the government to thwart off the white crowd that does not like illegals. And the same thing would be with the LGBT crowd, but that's a smaller faction. The percentage of LGBT in America is pretty low, but yes, if you ask me, could there be a second civil war in the country? I think it would be those two issues, one or the other. It would either be based on whites and conservatives, because there are some other races involved in the conservative party. It's mostly black, it's mostly white, but there are others that would be pissed off with those issues I mentioned, immigration or abortion, Muslims, or the LGBT crowd, or in some cases, racism. And the reason I say racism is because there are whites that are angry based on issues such as critical race theory being taught in schools, statues coming down, and the ostracizing of the Confederate flag. There are some whites that are really, really angry that we no longer want the Confederate flag in public buildings and things like that, and certain Confederate statues are coming down. Charlottesville is a perfect example of whites taking upon themselves to commit acts of violence in regards to a statue coming down. So don't say this stuff cannot happen. But what do you think? What do you think? Do you believe that this stuff is outlandish? Do you think there's absolutely no chance of something like this happening in America? I wholeheartedly disagree. I think that, like I said before, earlier in the video, the summer of 2020 with the rioting and looting taking place all over the country and what happened on January 6th are perfect examples of a lot of people being very angry and doing very bad things in a short period of time. So let me know what you think. And once again, I'm asked, like I said, always give your boy a thumbs up if you like what I just said. If you feel I missed anything, I'm off point, hit the thumbs down button. But I would like to hear what you had to say in the comments. I would like to hear where you think I'm missing this at. Do you think I'm just reading way too much into this shit? Let your boy know. Once again, as I said, always we respond to any and all comments, and show your boy some love. Hit that subscription button. It is Tim, the Handsome Liberal. I will catch you in the next video.